Right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alice Cornish, and I'm Head of Education at the Varkey Foundation. It's my great pleasure to welcome two very esteemed guests, Michael Gove and Arne Duncan, today. Both men, I think, need very little introduction. That's probably why so many of you are in the room today. Michael Gove, former Secretary of State for Education, former Secretary of State for Justice, and MP for Surrey Heath. It's a great pleasure to have Michael today. It's your first time, I believe, to the Global Education and Skills Forum. You're very, very welcome. Arne Duncan, former Secretary of Education under Barack Obama, also CEO of Chicago Public Schools, and now leading the Emerson Collective. Arne, you're a long-term friend of the foundation. You joined us last year, and your Meet the Mentor session was one of the most popular sessions from last year, so it's wonderful to have you back. Thank you for being here. And the world has changed a little bit since last year. We have a new president. And with that new president, he's brought a new Secretary of Education as well. Perhaps we'll go into that a little bit later. So I think just sort of let's start light, perhaps. So thinking about Betsy DeVos, who's just taken on that role of Secretary of Education, I thought it would be good just to take you back to your first few days. So you must know what that feeling is like, having the world's eyes on you. Perhaps you could share a little bit from that time.
I think my first couple of days are probably a little easier than her first couple of days. And happy to talk about this stuff. Yeah, to start light, I'll tell you one story I haven't told publicly. So you go in, it's a huge building, lots of. Most of the staff is career staff who stays. It's only about 150 to 200 what are called political staff. And so you go around and, fantastic folks who have dedicated their lives to education. So, walk the hall, shake hands, talk. But the one funny story is there's a TV in my office. And my assistant who came with me from Chicago was trying to turn the TV on, figure out how it works with the remote. She's hitting what she thinks is the remote control. But it's like the security alarm button.
Oh, God.
So all of a sudden you hear these sirens, and it's like they block off the street, and these guys come running up to the office, and they say, is everything okay? I'm like, yeah, everything's fine. I'm just trying to figure it out. But she hit the wrong button. She didn't hit the remote control.
Wow.
We never let her forget it.
Yeah, I feel like that's the first day from hell, isn't it? So, Michael, I guess your sort of situation was slightly different. Arne had 3 months to prepare for his new role, if you can prepare for such a job. You really had a matter of days after the coalition government was formed. So could you share some reflections on that time?
Yes. Well, first of all, it's a great pleasure to be here. And on the same, there we are, and on the same platform as Arne. As most people here will recall, when the government was formed in 2010, it wasn't clear who was going to do what job, apart from the fact that David Cameron was going to be Prime Minister and Nick Clegg his deputy. I had to, during the coalition negotiations, appear on TV to say that I hoped that everything would work out and that David would be able to lead a new government. And I was asked on one of those shows by a brilliant interviewer called Andrew Marr, would you be prepared to give up your job as Education Secretary in order to ensure that we have the safe, stable government this country needs at a moment of crisis and peril? And it's one of those questions to which there is only one answer. I don't think you can really say, no, I'm so utterly selfish that all I want is to have my chauffeur-driven car take me into this particular department, even as the rest of the world is crumbling. So, of course, I said, yes, of course. But as it turned out, being in a coalition was certainly initially a help, because the person who could have been the Education Secretary, my Liberal Democrat counterpart, a very fine politician called David Laws, became the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, the man in charge of allocating finances to government departments. And then in the first few days, he made sure that the Department for Education was set fair and that we had a strong budget and good protection, at least initially, in order to be able to push forward our reforms. But one thing I would say about my first day there is that I was very, very impressed by the way in which the civil service could anticipate some wishes. Because before the election, our department had a particular name. It was known as the Department for Children, Schools and Families, because our predecessor government had a particular emphasis on services which support education. And we'd said that we wanted to have an education department. And in the short walk from my having been appointed to arriving in the department, they had taken down all the old nameplates and put up some new nameplates. And this courtesy, very English, British civil service courtesy, also extended to every detail of my office. And I mean every detail. So when I came in, there was a bowl of fruit on the desk. And I said, well, that's very nice. And they said, well, we must apologize. This was your predecessor, Mr. Balls's choice of fruit. If you'd like a different choice of fruit, then of course, please let us know. But I said that even though I disagreed with Ed on many things, I thought his choice of fruit was excellent. So I was very happy to keep it.
Thank you. I should also say that, so I was actually a teacher, Michael, when you were Secretary of State for Education, and then I set up a parent engagement program in the US when you were Secretary of Education. So in many ways, both of you have actually been my boss at some time, so, so this should be fun.
Payback time.
Yeah. So stepping back to 2009, 2010, you both came into power at a reasonably similar time, within a year or so of one another. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the big challenges that you were facing at the time, some of the biggest issues? You know, what were the most pressing things in your inbox at that time?
Well, there were... the very first thing, as I mentioned, was the formation of a coalition. So we needed to make sure that two parties, which were similar in their education policies, but not identical, managed quickly to secure agreement. Before we could press ahead with reform, we had to be certain that both parties were going to support it. The second thing is that it was a time of great economic turbulence. I mean, again, when President Obama took over, it was after President Bush had seen the American economy face very, very, very difficult times. Similarly, when we took over in 2010, it was after a period of wrenching economic change. And I'm not trying to attribute responsibility to either President Bush or Gordon Brown. It just happened. Whoever was going to be in office at that time was going to have to face the fact that there were difficult economic headwinds. Now, our government had decided that one of the things we needed to do was to reduce public expenditure overall. We managed to preserve ring-fence spending per pupil, i.e. for those between the ages of 5 and 16. We had some very tough decisions to make about other spending, including capital spending. And one of the really first rocks that I hit as Education Secretary was in my desire to ensure that we spent capital more efficiently. I cancelled some previous school building programs. I think it was right to cancel them, but I did so in a way that was very clumsy and which caused considerable political difficulty for us. The other thing as well is that the teachers' unions come in all shapes and sizes, but at the time, most popular teachers' union, JUST, the NASUWT, had a very close and friendly relationship with my predecessor, and with me, not so much. And navigating some of those relationships initially was quite fraught as well. So I think both the difficult economic climate, the fact that that meant that we had to make some quick decisions and to deal with that, and the fact that some of those decisions, because they were taken at speed, weren't always taken gracefully, created difficulty. But there was one thing that we did have, which was an advantage. We had prepared a bill in opposition, a short bill, which we were able to introduce quickly. And the fact that we were able to hit the ground running and to legislate rapidly, and the fact that the legislation which allowed some schools which hadn't hitherto had the equivalent of charter freedoms to acquire charter freedoms, the fact that we were able to show a change on the ground relatively quickly, I think gave people a sense that even though we were sailing through headwinds, nevertheless we had a sense of direction.
So there are a few things that I'd love to come back to, if that's okay. Perhaps, is that okay? So just to pick up on your point around the teachers' unions, perhaps,
yes.
And then we could segue into charter schools, free schools, and have that discussion. But I think, it's clear to see that you're very, very passionate and believe very, very strongly in the policies that you put forward and had a very clear vision. Do you think that you struggled to bring teachers on board to that vision? And is there anything that you would have done differently, having kind of stepped away from that position?
Yes, I think I did. I think that there were some occasions where, in my anxiety to get a message across to a wider audience that I understood the vital need to raise standards, that some of the people who were already in education and had been in education long before I arrived might have felt that I was not paying proper respect to or not taking sufficient account of their efforts. So when I said that we needed to raise the bar, when I said why isn't every school as good as those which I visited and held up as the best, I think that there's arguably a sense in which you can better balance a celebration of the best with a recognition of the difficulties that others face. How you do that is always, always, always going to require a balancing act. And one of the things that I would note is that almost every UK education secretary, there are one or two examples, but almost every UK education secretary runs into opposition from and criticism from the teaching unions, and it's very, very rare that any education secretary is a pin-up in every staff room. So it's, I discovered when I was Justice Secretary as well, that in the UK, if you're Justice Secretary, you're very rarely the toast of the legal profession. That the government minister who's responsible for dealing with professionals in a particular area is there to represent the public interest. If you're representing the public interest, sometimes you will say to the professionals in that area, the public would like you to move in this direction, or would like to hold you to a different standard from the one that we've had hitherto. That's not always an easy message to get across. I think it's a necessary role for politicians to pursue, but just because it's necessary, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't always think, are we getting the balance right between proper challenge and a determination to improve, particularly because our first concern should be children, with an appropriate recognition as well that people who have chosen to go into teaching also want to put children first too.
Do you think teachers are ill-served by unions?
I think there are some union leaders whom I admire, even though I disagree with them. And so I think that I think that overall, I think the first thing to say is that the perception that teachers' unions and teachers are synonymous is a mistake. The view that all teachers take a monolithic view on all issues is unhelpful. There are lively debates in education between teachers about everything from different methods of instruction to the most appropriate way of allocating resources to ensure that you get the best results. Sometimes it's in the nature of unions, like in the nature of political parties, that the leaders of them have to present a single perspective when that doesn't do justice to the range of views there. So in that sense, unions don't do justice to that plurality of views. But I wouldn't want to criticize any individual trade union leader, because to lead any organization requires compromises. And I think that during the time that I was Education Secretary, even though we disagreed, it was always, always possible to have a civilized conversation with every single one of the general secretaries. And they were always, always looking to see how, if a deal could be done or if progress could be made on their terms, that could be done. So it was never the case that I encountered, certainly in private meetings, the sort of blanket opposition that people might sometimes have guessed from some of the more passionate rhetoric at certain times.
Arne, it's fair to say that you've also had challenges with the teachers' unions in the US. Was that a big challenge, one of the main issues for you as Secretary of Education?
No, I wouldn't say it is. I think it's really important that unions are not monolithic. And you have, in the States, you have the heads of 2 national unions, you have state unions, you have local unions. And I think this stuff, there's a lot of gray, and people like to paint it black and white. And we definitely had some challenges, some disagreements. We also sat down and had breakfast every month and talked through issues privately that people would have no idea that we were discussing. And you have a whole range of union leaders, from those that maybe I might consider a little bit more Neanderthal to some that are extraordinarily progressive and lead with tremendous courage and take lots of heat internal for where they're trying to go. So I'll always resist any attempt to paint any group that diverse into a corner. That for me doesn't do it justice.
Thank you. And just to sort of go back then to charter schools and free schools. So charter schools was something that you were a big proponent of in the US. Under the new Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, that's likely to explode even more, the charter school movement. How far do you think this could go? I mean, where do you think it could stop?
Well, let me be very, very clear that I'm a fan of good charter schools. And I'm a fan of good traditional schools and good magnet schools and good IB schools. and I'm not a fan of bad schools. And the name charter tells me nothing about quality. And all I care about is qualities and results for kids. And so, yes, we put significant resources, a couple $100 million behind replicating high-quality charter schools. And I visited amazing schools that were transforming opportunities for kids. I also went to the National Charter School Conference and challenged them to close the lowest performing schools and not hide behind the name charter and have that brand, tarnished. And so for me, and Kemi, I worry going forward, the goal for me is not 1,000 more charters. The goal is more high-quality schools. And you have to have, for charters to be successful, I think you need two things. You need real autonomy. They have to have independence. They have a vision. They have creative leaders. But there has to be clear accountability. And if you're missing the accountability point, which frankly in the current secretary's her home state of Michigan, they had lots of charters, very little quality measures, very little around accountability, and they were actually pretty mediocre. And that's just, you're just perpetuating the system that already poorly serves kids. So I think if you couple those two things, you have a chance to be successful. If you don't, you're not going to get there. And again, I always think it's important that great charters should be learning from great traditional schools, and great traditional schools should be learning from charters. No one has a monopoly on good ideas here. And the final thing I'll say is that you've asked any 6 or 7-year-old, they don't know if they go to a charter school or a traditional school, and they just, does my teacher care about me? Am I learning? Am I safe? We just need a lot more schools that look like that. I always say we have one common goal, and that's academic success, one common enemy, that's academic failure, and whatever we can do to have more success and less failure, whatever form or fashion that takes, we need to go down that path.
So autonomy, accountability are sort of clearly sort of very important in this issue. Just to kind of bring in free schools here, so if we're talking about free schools and charter schools, do you think there should be ever a limit on the ability for schools to turn into charter schools or free schools? Should there be the right accountability and autonomy processes in place?
Well, I agree with Arne that the most important thing is the experience that children have. And the most important thing is that a school should have high expectations for every child and should seek to counteract whatever disadvantages those children have been born into in order to give them all the same opportunities. The reason for having free schools, academies, or charter schools is not to prove an intellectual point or to create diversity for its own sake, though diversity for its own sake is a generally good thing. The point is to introduce innovation into the system and challenge, and by using the correct accountability measures and discovering what works, make sure that more and more schools adopt that. There's a related thing as well. I think that the more that education is seen to be in the hands of teachers, the more that when you look at groups of schools, it's a teacher who's leading them rather than an elected official or politician or bureaucrat, the better. And I also think the more that teachers have the scope within individual schools to design everything from the length of the school day to the emphasis on particular subjects in a way that they think is right for their students, the better. One of the reasons also why we wanted to allow free schools to be set up is that we wanted more teachers to play a part in shaping what the future of education would look like. And the point we made is that if you're a professional and you're a doctor, you can set up your own medical practice. If you're a professional and you're a lawyer, you can set up your own law center and work amongst the very poorest in society. If you're a teacher, you were not able to set up your own school, to establish your own vision, and to provide a better alternative. And some of the very, very best free schools in the United Kingdom are those that have been set up by teachers who wanted to do something different. Whether it's School 21 or Michaela Community School, very different schools with very different philosophies. Both of them, I think, wonderfully innovative and with the welfare of the child at the heart of everything that they do. But Arne is also right that you absolutely need effective accountability, and that means having an inspection system that is rigorous but also sensitive, and also continually looking to see how you grade the school and the students within it in order to make sure that you've got a grading system that is fair, that emphasizes in particular the value that a school adds or the progress that children make, and also at the same time you are sensitive to the fact that any system that holds public servants accountable can sometimes be at risk of gaming, and that you've got to try to be alive to that in the interests of the children, and not generating perverse consequences.
And that's perhaps what we've seen a little bit in the US. So, there are tales of schools offering cash bonuses to get students, or offering iPads to attract the students who obviously bring funding with them. Does it worry you that charter schools or free schools could create a sort of wild west of education?
Maybe stories, that's not the norm or typical, and that doesn't sort of ring a bell. And I think, so no, I worry less about that. As long as you have those two things in place, then it's not the Wild West. If it's just anyone who wants to open a school can open a school, that's the Wild West. And so the accountability piece, and I just want to echo Michael's point, I think it's so important. Accountability, you always have to have two sides of the same coin, and folks in this room know this, but let's just say it's a high school, and one of the measures is college going rates, and 100% of graduates are going to college. That's great. The question you have to ask is, how many kids is that school pushing out before they get to their senior year? And are you creating those perverse incentives? So you always have to have two sides of the same coin, be very, very thoughtful that your own accountability system, while well-intended, actually does a disservice to kids. Are they pushing out special needs kids? Are they pushing out the kids who need the most help? And so you just have to it's not just accountability for accountability's sake, but really trying to think as everyone's interests align in getting the best outcomes for every child.
And do you think that the standards exist in the US to be able to ensure that schools can be held accountable and have that autonomy that you speak of? And if this policy is to explode under the new Secretary of Education, what advice would you be giving her to make sure that it is controlled and there are those structures in place?
Well, obviously, the United States is an interesting model of decentralization. There are pros and cons there, and we can talk about all that. But let me just be very clear. The best set of charter schools are in Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, data, on average, kids going to charter schools are picking up 50, 60, 70 additional days of math each year on average, and the same thing on reading language arts. And so at scale, they're not perfect. They've done it right. They've done it right. Other states, they are sort of more, at the same level of traditional schools. But they, I think, have had that right combination. But I want to be very, very clear that, charter schools, again, I'm a big fan of the good ones. We put a lot of money behind it. Charter schools are always going to serve a relatively tiny percent of kids in the system. And I don't want to say it's small ball, but it is sort of small ball. And at the national level, you have to think about every kid. And 95% of kids are never going to set foot in charter school. And I worry a lot with the current administration that there's a focus on sort of politics and ideology and not about every kid. And we have to walk and chew gum. We can support charters, but you guys spend the vast majority of your time on the traditional schools because that's where the vast majority of kids are going to go, and that's where your resources have to go. And so you can't get caught up on the small stuff for politics and leave behind 53 million kids.
Sure. So I suppose this is where the US and the UK differ due to our size. In the UK, £320 million of funding has been set aside to expand free schools, and within that, new selective grammar schools. I'd just like to talk about this. It's something that's been occupying the headlines. Would you be happy if more schools had the ability to select based on academic ability?
Well, while I was Secretary of State, we created some new selective schools, selective at the age of 16, of course, and it was great to see the Prime Minister visit one of those, the King's College Math School, which has been a huge success. And I think that it was striking that when the government's industrial strategy, the British government's industrial strategy was launched earlier this year with a green paper, that one of the centerpieces of that was the expansion of those specialist math schools, selecting at 16. I think that, again, the approach that one should take is not to be ideologically committed to any particular type of school, but to ask does the evidence justify the creation of a particular type of school in particular circumstances? And so my commitment is to be open-minded about that, and I think that the Secretary of State takes a similar view in the UK as well, that she wants to ensure that the evidence is there before this welcome expansion in choice. She wants to be certain, I'm sure, that if selective schools are created, that the evidence can justify their creation in any particular area.
So just to be clear on that point, so if you were in her position right now, would you be introducing that same policy and bringing in a policy that was to expand selective grammar schools?
Well, if I were in that position, I would have to be doing what the Prime Minister wanted me to do.
Such a politician.
And since the Prime Minister has a thumping mandate from Conservative MPs and all the rest of it, I think she has every right to shape education policy in the way that she thinks is right. I think that the best thing that people who've been in the job beforehand can do is to try to support the current Education Secretary in her efforts and to recognise that she's doing an outstanding job.
So now that you're outside of outside of that role, is it something that you support?
I support the government. I'm a very, very...
Arne, okay.
How
much selection?
Slavish.
How much selection exists in the US, and is that sort of something that you think is important?
Selection based upon
Academic ability.
Yeah, there's some, not some magnet schools and things like that. I'm a big believer just in choice generally, and I think there's lots of room to move, whether you call it vocational education or career and technical education or education to careers, the space of trying to prepare more kids not just to go to college, which we need a lot more of, but more young people to go into the world of work. I would love to just have more options. I love, STEM is a huge area, fine and performing arts, and every child has different skills and interests, and the more in a perfect world, at a minimum, every child has to have access to one great school, and that does not exist today, to be very clear. We have a long way to go. But in a perfect world, particularly at the high school, secondary level, if you had 2 or 3 or 4 different types of schools to choose from, that would be nirvana.
So to kind of continue on that line of thinking, so looking at the quality of schools in the US and the UK, in 1983, A Nation at Risk was published, which compared the ineffectiveness of US public schools to, in effect, an act of war. 34 years has passed since that publication. Around $1.4 trillion of federal spending has been fed into education, and that doesn't even include the spending at state level. Do you think enough has changed? I mean, listening to Andreas Schleicher today, the US and the UK are still occupying those middle levels in the PISA rankings. Do you think enough has been done over the last few years?
No. And it's interesting, we all have a chance to sort of reflect on successes and failures, and happy to talk about both sides of that ledger. But the critique that I got the most was that we were going too fast, and my self-critique is that we weren't going fast enough. And, just take one, some things I'm very, very proud of getting high school graduation rates to all-time highs and reductions in dropout rates, and many more students of color, African-American, Latino students going on to college, a lot more money to make college affordable. But at the end of the day, we still have, with the 84, 85% graduation rate, we still have 600, 700,000 kids each year dropping out of high school across the country. You think about that in today's economy, they have no chance. They're basically condemned to poverty and social failure. And we have to get better faster. Part of what we did that was wildly controversial and Race to the Top, we can talk about the details, was just talk about and incentivize high standards. High standards wasn't my idea. That came from 20 years ago from Nation at Risk and a bunch of governors. They had talked about it, but nothing ever happened. We actually put some carrots out there, and we saw 44, 45 states adopt them. But no, we have to get the world, everyone here knows, the world is changing way too fast. When I was growing up in the south side of Chicago, I'm not that old, but if my friends dropped out, it was not the end of the world. They could go work in the stockyards and steel mills and have a job and support a family and buy a home. Those jobs don't exist anymore. They're never coming back. and the cost of academic failure has never been higher. So I think all of us have to figure out how we get better much faster, and how do we help the kids in communities who are the most disadvantaged. And none of us are doing enough. None of us are doing enough.
Michael, what about your reflections on the UK and we're sort of still in the same boat really as the US. There's a lot more to be done. Why do you think those problems still persist?
I think there is undoubtedly more to be done. I just say 2 or 3 things. The first thing is that yes, Britain and America occupy similar rankings to the position that applied when Arne and I came to office, but the first thing to say is that there are other comparator countries that have declined in that time. And it's striking that both Wales and Scotland have declined relative to England. And I think that predates my arrival in office. It has to do with the fact that both the Welsh and the Scottish governments moved away from rigorous external accountability, from league tables, and from a proper analysis of what was going well and what was going badly in their state system. There were some other changes that they made as well, particularly in Scotland with the curriculum, that I don't think serve students well. Related to that, it does take time. I know that this is the endless, excuse that politicians have, but it's true. If you introduce significant changes, if you introduce race to the top into the American school system, imagine that it has a dramatic effect on the children that year. Probably won't have that year, but imagine it does that year. It will take several years before you can see that working through in terms of the overall performance of the school system and indeed the particular fate of individual children. So I think it's still too soon to say. I think that there are measurable improvements. I think in a previous session that we had, people like Michael Wilshaw, the Chief Inspector, and others were good enough to say that there had been measurable improvements during the time that, since 2010. I think actually the improvements in some parts started well before then, but British education's been getting better, English education's been getting better. But I think that there is a natural desire for politicians and their critics to want to make instant judgments. And while, of course, there are things of which I'm proud, to which I would point and say that was a clear sign of progress, I think it is just too soon to make a definitive judgment about either what the Obama administration achieved, and I think it achieved significant things in the field of education, or what our government has achieved.
I guess there's a challenge around politics in general here, that a lot of the policies that can be brought in can change in 4 or 5 years with a new administration that come in. Do you worry about what Betsy DeVos might do in the US? How much of a concern do you have for what might happen to education under her administration?
Lots of concerns. Lots of concerns at lots of levels. I'll just start with, they came out with a budget that has tremendous cuts in education, and we should absolutely debate whether money we're spending is being spent wisely. But I can't find any reason why spending less money in education is the right thing for kids who are being underserved. There's no logic there. Let me just sort of take it up a notch and sort of explain why I'm worried. To be very clear, for me, it's not about Republican or Democratic or left or right. I probably got more critique from the left than I did from the right. So for me, it's got to be just pragmatism, not ideology. But for me, there should be goals that are national goals. I would love our goal to be, in the United States, to lead the world in access to high-quality early childhood education. I think that's the best investment we can make. Right now, we're about 28th, 29th. We should be ashamed. We should be absolutely ashamed. We got high school graduation rates up to 84%. The goal of the next administration should be to get those to 90%. The goal should be to have 100% of that 90% actually prepared to take college-level classes, not take remedial classes. That's the point of high standards. And then we're currently 12th in the world in terms of college completion. We used to be first. 11 other countries have out-educated, out-innovated us. Our goal should be to lead the world. For me, those are nation-building goals. They aren't left or right. Now, we can have lots of very fair debate about the best strategies to achieve those goals. And again, no one has a monopoly on good ideas, and we should try all kinds of different things to achieve them. But Alice, what worries me the most is you have no conversation, zero, about any of those goals. And candidly, when before this election, both on the Democratic and Republican side, you didn't have conversation about any of those goals. And for me, it's always small ball. It's always little things for political points. And if we could agree on those goals as a nation, and then we all compete to have the best ideas to achieve them, then kids win, and the politics don't matter. But we're not in that game, and that is very scary to me.
And, you know, Donald Trump has spoken out against the Department for Education, and it's sort of implied that he might want to withdraw funding from the Department for Education. What will you be doing, and what should other people in the US, in the world, be doing in order to ensure that you have those national goals?
Well, clearly, I've not done a good job because he's not listening to me these days. So I'll keep trying. I should probably say the opposite, and that would probably work better. Have no national goals, then he might do some. But alternative goals. There we go. You're hired. No, I'll say two quick things. One is, again, for me, it's unjustifiable to reduce the investment in education. Let's have lots of vigorous debate about the best use of every scarce tax dollar. But to say somehow we're investing too much in education, you can't justify, that in any way, shape, or form. I'll come back on my second point, but yeah, just try to think about where we need to go, hold him accountable, and to be clear, let me back up. The challenge isn't. I should finish this. I don't blame Trump and I don't blame Hillary Clinton. I blame us as voters, because we don't hold politicians accountable for academic results at the local level, mayors, state, or federal level. And so it's easy to point fingers at them, but if you watch the presidential debates, no one talked about education. Why? Because no one votes on education. So it really comes back to, what can we do? We can actually, across the political spectrum, say we care about results. We care about accountability, and we're going to hold you accountable to keep your job, to make sure kids are learning.
Michael, did you want to respond at all to that?
I agree. I think that I was glad that we were able, between 2010 and 2015, to ensure that education was the best protected domestic department, apart from the NHS, at a time of economic stringency. It's very, very difficult for my colleagues who are in government now, because lots of other services have had to take big hits. Prisons, I know about; social care, obviously, local government. And at the same time, there are rising population pressures, which put additional burdens on those charged with improving education. But we've got to continue to make the case for investment in the future. And I also agree with Arne about one other thing as well, which is that even as we acknowledge that our systems are improving, there are two particular groups that I think, or two particular areas that I think need even more attention. One of them is early years education. There's been a welcome expansion in the provision of early years education in the last few years in the UK. I think we now need to have a new emphasis on quality in early years education to make sure that the workforce there is trained and supported to provide an even higher quality experience, so that more children arrive at school ready to learn and confident in themselves. The second thing is alternative provision. I think one of the other areas that we need to do more in is for those children who have behavioural problems, who find themselves excluded, and who place a disproportionate burden on the state. And if we have both the right mechanisms in identifying their problems early, and also the right alternative provision for them if necessary, then we can transform the lives of people who would otherwise be bringing pain and misery on themselves and others.
And do you think there's enough money in the education system in England to do that?
There's never enough money, but I think that it can be done, yes.
So I'd like to talk about something which is, it's been a very common theme over the last sort of year or so, talking about immigration. There are, and this is sort of very relevant to our theme here around global citizenship. So we published our Generation Z survey recently, and it actually showed that students around the world were very tolerant when it came to immigration. They, on the whole, wanted to see legal migration into their countries, particularly in the UK and the US. Do you worry about the impact that immigration policies, whether that's through Trump or whether any consequences of Britain leaving the EU, do you worry about how that could impact education?
I think you've got to pay attention to a variety of factors here. The first is that there's lots of evidence that London, having become more diverse, has contributed to educational standards rising in London. Now, I'm not saying that that's the only cause, far from it, but I do think it is the case, and I know this from my experience as a parent with 2 children in London state schools, London state comprehensives, that many of the children who've, or whose parents, more to the point, have come here in recent years, have extraordinarily high expectations of the state system. And so some of the most demanding parents and some of the most involved parents are those who've come from, they might be refugees from Somalia or Kosovo, but they want their children to succeed in Britain as British citizens. And so they have very, very high expectations of the schools, both academically and also as institutions that give people a sense of Britishness. It's undeniably the case that there are other parts of the United Kingdom where educational performance is lower, and which are often areas where some of the same pressures haven't applied. So I'm not saying that there's an automatic equation between new people arriving and higher expectations and all of that being wonderful, but I do think it's the case that as we develop a balanced approach towards migration, we need to recognize that it has contributed in some cases to a drive towards higher standards. It has also contributed in other cases to pressure on services. So there have been rising class sizes and difficulty for some people getting their children into the school they wanted because new arrivals from other countries have made that more difficult. And for any government, in balancing that, it's a part of the broader problem that we have in balancing migration. Migration can be a really good thing for a country's economy. Openness is a virtue that we should all appreciate. But at the same time, if a country changes too rapidly, the strain placed on public services and also the sense of cohesion that you need for a country to be a successful enterprise, they pose questions as well. So in this very sensitive debate, I think the best thing to do is for those of us involved in education to try to say, let's look at the evidence and let's treat feelings on every side of this debate with sensitivity and respect.
So you'd say that should Brexit lead to a reduction in migration to Britain, that would have a negative, or could have a negative impact on the standards of schooling?
I think it's a balance, because I think the thing is that while it's undoubtedly the case, and the point I was trying to make is that it's not, to borrow Arne's great phrase earlier, it's not a black and white thing, it's a grey area, because there are benefits that migration brings, but also there are costs. And I think it's important to be clear about both and to balance them, and to do so in a way which arrives at what I think personally is the right approach, which is to have a government that's in control of the number of people who come here, because if you have public confidence that there is control of the number of people who come to any country, then you can benefit from a healthy inflow of people who bring skills and talent, and also you can benefit from greater tolerance towards the need to house refugees and those fleeing persecution at particular points.
So the US and the UK are both hotbeds of global talent. I mean, we have students from all around the world at all levels of education, but particularly at higher education. I think in the UK there are many more STEM students who are international students, and far fewer from particularly public schools in the UK. In the US, I saw you tweet this week, I think, about a 40% reduction in international students in US colleges. What impact do you think that's going to have on innovation, STEM, education in the US?
Yeah, and to be clear, it wasn't a 40% reduction. It was 40% of colleges reporting a reduction.
Right.
I don't know the exact numbers. But I'll just, again, I always try to be very honest. I'm just extraordinarily troubled and concerned directionally where things are going. I mean, state the obvious. We are a nation built by immigrants. Immigrants to our country come seeking a better life for their kids, which by definition means a better education that they as their parents didn't have. no one wakes up in the morning and says, I want to be a refugee. That's no one's aspiration. They're fleeing for their lives. When you look at Silicon Valley and all the startups and what's driving so much of our economy, like a quarter of those startups are led, the CEOs and immigrants. And I just think there's just there are challenges, there are costs, but there's a wealth of talent and hard work and entrepreneurial skills and innovation that we desperately need. And we have to embrace that and help them create jobs for us. The flip side now, because it's going so much the other direction, there is so much fear of young kids across the country worried about their mother or father being deported, worried about them being deported. The fear is tangible. I visit schools and I can't answer the kids' questions. And whenever kids are living with that kind of fear, it's hard to concentrate on algebra or biology. So this is one that we're going to fight with every fiber we have, and try and give kids a chance to be successful in our country and get a good education.
Thank you. I want to leave plenty of time for questions because I know that there will be lots from the audience. But just to finish my questioning, we have lots of ministers of education at this forum. Many of them may well be in this room. What advice would you be giving them as former secretaries of state, secretary of education, as someone who's been through this?
I think the first thing is enjoy it. It's such a wonderful, wonderful thing to be working in education. And sometimes in the midst of all the criticism and as you were sitting up late at night trying to make sure that some budget can balance and it looks as though it never will, just bear in mind that you're working in the best area of government and you get to work with the best people in public service. And if you succeed in radiating that enthusiasm and enjoyment yourself, then hopefully your team will pick up on that. Because if it's the opposite, if you look downtrodden and beaten, then the one thing you won't be able to do is drive the change you want. So that's the first. The second thing I would say is get as many different voices in the room as possible. So when you are thinking about how to change policy, obviously have a clear view of what it is that you require, but make sure that you've heard the opposition argument, both in order to test the strength of your own and sometimes to have a course correction in order to both pick up support and also to refine the course on which you want. So I'm not suggesting that you have 12 people in the room and you find the lowest common denominator and that becomes your policy position. I'm saying that you have 12 people in a room and you have a vigorous discussion and you follow what the best arguments are. And then I think the third thing is always keep in mind what your overriding purpose is. It's very easy in any government office to be distracted by things, to get drawn into the issues of the moment, instead of keeping a strategic focus on the 2, 3, or 4 main goals that you have. So make sure that you always bear in mind what it is that you will want to have achieved by the end of, say, 4 years, and be prepared to sacrifice potentially tempting opportunities to secure, to pick low-hanging fruit along the way in order to focus on what the really big strategic goals are.
I echo all of those. Those are great ones. And 2 or 3 other quick ones, and actually pretty similar. One is, doing this work is just an extraordinary privilege. And people say, it's hard, it's whatever. It was the joy of my life to have that opportunity. And those, for me, 7 years flew by. And whatever difficulties, whatever hard issues we're dealing with, it is so much easier than what our kids are living with every single day in so many of our communities. And so understand how lucky we are to have the chance to do this work. Secondly, this is a little maybe counterintuitive, is I think you have to be willing to make mistakes. And I think all the pressure, again, is to go slow and to, don't do anything wrong. And if you do that, you won't accomplish anything. Now, you want to have a lot more victories than you do failures. But I would tell my team all the time, I'd rather bat 70 or 80%. If we're trying to bat 1,000, we're not going to get there. We're going to go way, way too slow. And you have to build a culture. The diversity point that Michael made is a huge one. But you got to build a culture where when you do make mistakes, and you will, you have people's back, and you don't throw them under the bus, because you have to go at a pace where things aren't going to go exactly perfectly. And then third, I'd go back to those goals I talked about: early childhood education, high school graduation, high school graduates being prepared for the world of work and careers, and college completion. Those goals, I think, are somewhat universal, and to stay right there, and are you spending time every day against those and not getting caught in the crisis of the moment or the headline of the moment.
So you're pleased you didn't pursue a career as a professional basketball player? I've seen the YouTube clips. Okay, so just to let you all know what's happening, we are going to have to finish a little bit early, about 4:15 today. So we have about 20 minutes for questions. Do we have a roving mic? Yes, great. So perhaps if we take 3 questions at a time. Okay, so lady here, gentleman there, gentleman here.
Hello, my name's Annie Egger. I've sat in this room for the last 2 forums. And congratulations, Arne. You were the first person to mention special educational needs. So, well done. How do you see the future catering for these children, especially in view of the discussion of selective schooling, and acknowledging that 14.5% of the UK children have SEN?
Okay.
My question is, I'm Paul Solers from the States, 5th grade teacher. My question is about standardized testing. I'd love to know how we could possibly identify high-performing schools without standardized testing, because it's currently taking, so much preparation and so much time out of actual instruction and learning. I'd like to hear anything you might have to say on that.
Okay, last one.
Hi, my name is AJ Nagaraj. I'm from Education Advisory Board in Washington, D.C. My question is about teacher recruitment and retention. I think all of us in the room would acknowledge the incredibly important role that high-quality teachers play in enhancing student success. But particularly in the States, Secretary Duncan, we're in the midst of a teacher shortage. I'm wondering, as you think about the root causes of that, if you had to advise Secretary DeVos and other leaders in the U.S. As to what kind of some of the most impactful things that we can do across the next 5 to 10 years to solve that problem, would love to hear your thoughts on that.
So can I suggest perhaps, Michael, are you happy to take the first one on catering to SEN children, perhaps Arne on standardized testing, and then teacher retention and recruitment and retention is something that affects both the US and the UK, so perhaps both comment on that one?
Of course. On SEN, looking backwards, we sought to reform the framework for identifying the specific special educational needs that children have and putting in place the right support. One of the things that I have always tried to stress is that special educational needs covers, by definition, a huge spectrum. So there are some particular low-frequency, high-impact needs that children have, whether that's visual impairment or hearing loss or severe learning difficulties that often require quite expensive but worthwhile investments in order to ensure that those children lead worthwhile lives. Then there are other children who may have behavioral, emotional, and social difficulties. They're quite rightly identified as having special educational needs, but sometimes a different set of interventions are appropriate for those children. And then there are other areas, children on the autistic spectrum or children who have dyslexia, dyscalculia, or other screening problems who require, yet again, a very different set of interventions. And I think the most important thing is to help schools screen and identify appropriately what the root causes are, and to put the right support in place. And in Britain, one of my concerns is that we need to have, in particular, better child and adolescent mental health services. And one of the mistakes that I made was not paying enough attention to mental health when I was Education Secretary, something that my successor, Nicky Morgan, quite rightly put renewed emphasis on and did a brilliant job in bringing to the forefront of the Department for Education's work. The teacher recruitment and retention crisis is a problem across the West. It's partly linked to the fact that as our economies both recover and change, so there are more opportunities for talented graduates, particularly but not exclusively in maths and sciences. Those are the areas where the teacher shortages are most acute. How do we deal with that? I think that we need to look at proper teacher remuneration, safeguarding teachers' work-life balance, and also how teachers are viewed in society. And I think that can only be resolved through a conversation between teachers themselves and government, because both have a part to play in making sure that everyone accords teachers the respect that they deserve and which everyone in this room would wish to see them enjoy.
Quickly, Tessie's an hour-long conversation. The short answer would be, I think, particularly with technology now, having, whether it's daily or weekly assessments of what kids are actually learning. You can do that in 2 or 3 questions. And for me, the goal is never to teach, it's to actually have kids learn. And starting to have real-time data for teachers every single day of who's learning what and what's effective. That was impossible 10 years ago. That's actually happening in schools now. So for me, it's less, high stakes once a year, 3 or 4 hours, and more daily, weekly, who's learning what. Now, so I always think I'm a fan of assessment. I don't think you walk away from that. Having said that, assessment for me is always what I call a lagging indicator. Leading indicators, trust, high expectations, safety. There's a series of things you can survey students and parents and teachers on. If the climate's right, all the other things will follow. If the climate's not right, those things won't follow. So really listening to kids, listening to parents, listening to teachers about the climate in buildings is a huge predictor of whether good things are going to happen for kids or not. On teacher recruitment, obviously it's a huge challenge. This is where I think in the United States, I think it's broken. I think the whole, from how we prepare teachers to how we mentor them, to how we support them, to career ladders, to master and mentor teachers. So from 18 years old to 65, I think we need radical change. Our levers at the federal level were dull, and we didn't do much, so I give us a very low grade there. Just one, this does not solve it, one radical idea, and this isn't news. I did a speech on this at National Press Club. I'm not a fan of mass incarceration. I think it's been a disaster in the States. If you took out half of the nonviolent felons out of prison, that would free $15 billion a year, no new taxes. That $15 billion should give every teacher in a high-poverty school a 50% pay increase. Just different use of money.
Okay, 3 more questions then. So how about lady in blue at the back there, gentleman behind her, and then one down here as well.
Hi, I've had the chance to live and work in education in both the US and the UK for years. And in neither country did I see a systemic program for global education and learning. Definitely initiatives, but a kind of national embrace. Not really. And so I'm wondering if you could talk about that, some of the things you've done I may not know about, and can you envision a day when that would exist?
Okay, gentleman behind.
Hello, my name is Samir. I run a program in India and now in other countries to support school leadership and really use that as a key lever to driving change. And it seems to me that is kind of an underinvested area as a way of making change, and just curious to hear from your perspective why that might be and what can be done about it.
And then I think the lady down the front here.
Hi, I'm Camilla Towner from The Telegraph. Just wondering what you thought about George Osborne's appointment as editor of the Evening Standard, and and did he rob you of the job?
Should we start with that one?
Was that for me or for Michael?
That's for you, Arne.
Well, I welcome high-quality recruits to the world of journalism. As a professional journalist myself, and so I wish George well. And the thing is that I'm a columnist rather than an editor, so I know that the right thing to do with editors is always to say yes, sir, and that columnists should concentrate on their own particular role. The second thing, global education. I think that if by that you mean our governments supporting drives to improve education, particularly in the developing world, no.
Teaching the curriculum within the UK or within the US, sort of an intentional curriculum of learning about the world. A curriculum where students are encouraged to build global competency within the UK or multicultural competency at a national level.
Well, I think there are several things that I would say. I think the first is that when you were thinking about education, and in fact we're going to have a debate about this afterwards, where I'm speaking on one side and Julie Gillard from Australia is speaking on another. I think if you were thinking about, for example, teaching literature, it's only going to be natural that children should be taught literature in their own language first, but that literature should hopefully expand the level of human empathy. I think it's also the case that when we're thinking about history or geography, particularly history, it's understandable that people should want to know their own nation's history. But certainly with countries like Britain and America, you cannot understand that nation's history in isolation from global events. Britain's association with other nations throughout its history is an inextricable part of our story. And America, of course, is a nation of immigrants that has also had a more decisive influence on the globe than any other country. So I think they're inextricably linked. But I do sense that also there are particular concerns that you might have about the way that some of those subjects are taught and the competencies that are delivered that are part of an evolving conversation that is probably better left in some respects to educationists rather than politicians, because politicians sometimes can look at curricula through a narrower set of lenses than educationists can as well, or do as well, I should say.
So the other question, you may want to comment on that previous one, but the other question was around school leadership and it's being an under-invested in area.
So just quickly, in terms of the United States and global education, I don't think we do enough. I think it's a very fair critique. It's not something we're allowed to play with at the federal level. We tried to fund things like the IB curriculum, which I'm a big fan of, but there's not much to do there. But I think we tend to be very parochial. And my wife, who's Australian, reminds me of that on an almost daily basis. And I think, again, we do our kids a disservice when we don't expose them to this world that's getting smaller every single day. On the principal point we haven't talked about today, it's a huge, huge, huge point. So thank you for the work you're doing. I've visited amazing schools everywhere. I've never been to an amazing school that didn't have an amazing principal. I keep looking for a great school that doesn't have a good principal, and I can't find it. I don't think I'm going to find it. A recent study came out of the Chicago Public Schools, where I'm from, and Chicago's had all kinds of challenges and budget issues and strikes, and one of my successors is going to jail, all kinds of craziness. But they have kept a focus on principal leadership, and a lot of it's been driven by public-private partnerships and from the outside, and that has sustained real progress through some crazy times. And I think it's, anyway, you can do lots of, teacher training, you can do lots of other things. If you don't have a good principal, those good teachers will leave that school. So whatever we can, if every school had a good principal, we could all retire, we'd be done.
So question at the back here, the lady here, and then down the front.
Matthew Goldie-Scott of the Carfax Education Group. I have a question for Mr. Gove. Setting aside the debate about charitable status entirely, I would be most interested to hear your views about the role that the independent sector has to play, not only within the educational landscape of the United Kingdom, but also as part of the brand of British education as an export, particularly here within the Middle East and in South Asia nearby, where British education plays such a prominent role.
Well, we're blessed in the United Kingdom in having superb state schools, but also superb independent fee-paying schools. And if we're thinking about schools that have global influence, then some of our independent fee-paying schools, when you look at the students that they educate and the influence that previous students of those schools have had in terms of global leadership, then they're a huge asset for our country. I also think that the traditions of scholarship and intellectual endeavor and also character building, which are features of our best independent schools, are a great, great asset to our country. And that's one of the reasons why so many people from across the globe choose to send children to schools in England. The thing I would say is that I also strongly believe that independent schools have to play a part in supporting the state education system in the country of which they're part. And the very, very good thing is that there are a growing number of independent head schools and governors who enthusiastically agree with that.
Hi, Jasudhara Bhattacharya. My question has to do with the integration of immigrants into different societies. So when immigrants encounter different societies, and I speak as someone who grew up not very far from here, you know, and therefore had a very different perspective when I, for example, went to Canada and then the United States, and I did go to a British school here. What do you do, or what gaps and what policies have you seen in terms of efforts to integrate immigrants through the education system that addresses that they might have a different relationship with the state? Because, for example, what you would encounter here in terms of a relationship with the state is not necessarily what you would encounter in the US. And also values. So while I went to a British system, because of the geopolitics in the area, I did encounter a diet of anti-Americanism at the time. So what efforts are being made, or perhaps what gaps do you see in terms of addressing those values through the school system so that you can authentically integrate individuals who might not necessarily either share the same values because of how they are, what they're encountering in the world around them, or not understand the differences when you're a child, a teenager, you know, even a young adult, not understand the differences of where they might be coming from and where they are going into. Thank you.
Can I ask,
Yeah.
when you said that you encountered a diet of anti-Americanism, was that in the United Kingdom?
No.
No, okay.
It was not very far from here. So, yeah, and it's because of the geopolitics in the area, you know, and I do hope I get to go back to the US after saying this, so please, you know.
Do we want to take the one here, and then we'll go to the answers?
Hi, my question is around early childhood education, which Arne Duncan was talking about. I agree with its value. For me, the importance of early childhood education is teaching socialization, independence, practical life, gross motor skills, fine motor skills. But it seems to me now that many nursery schools are promising that if you send your child to the school, they will be reading, writing, speaking French, Arabic, English, and Chinese, which should be called Mandarin, by the way. Another point, when they leave. So can you comment on what is the most, or are the most important aspects of early childhood education and this movement away from play-based learning?
Okay, who would like to take the early years? And
I'm happy to take it. It's a great question, and I've really tried to follow James Heckman's research. He's a Nobel Prize-winning economist at the University of Chicago, came to this as a skeptic, and has become a huge convert. Again, talks about the 7-to-1 ROI. For every dollar we invest in early childhood, we get back $7 as taxpayers. And it's interesting, I've asked him, we've talked about it, and I think he's right, or intuitively I think he's right. He has the research. He thinks more than half that value is the non-academic side. It's helping kids from very poor communities be able to interact in a room like this and take turns and feel comfortable and confident. And to be clear, I never want to walk away from the academic side. Our kids need to be able to read. They don't necessarily have to be able to read in pre-K, but you can sort in third grade. Those kids that can't read, they got tough lives ahead of them. But I think these are always false choices, it's both and. And the fact is that the grit, the persistence, the resilience, the ability to interact, the ability to be part of a team, part of a group, those are life skills. And that is as important, and I would argue probably a little bit more important than the academic piece. And so we cannot lose that.
Michael, did you want to either add to that or take the question about integration?
I agree with Arne. There's a very good article in the latest issue of Scientific American Mind, which makes the point that structured play-based learning, which drives children towards developing some of the competencies that you mentioned, is the right thing. So I think it's not an either-or, it's a both-and. On the whole point about integration, I think that both Britain and America are countries that have worked hard at different times and have seen, to promote integration, and have seen education as a means of doing so. I am an admirer of the way in which the vision of American education, going back to Dewey and before that, was about building a nation of citizens and giving people the intellectual capital to be able to be fully part of a great republic. And in Britain, I think one of our aims in education was to ensure that children had not just the skills in English and mathematics to be able to follow political debate and make judgments about budget decisions, but also that they had a shared understanding of a nation's history and felt part of that story, even if their parents had arrived just a week beforehand, or they could trace their lineage back to the time of William the Conqueror. And I think that concentrating on ensuring that schools are places where everyone feels that they're part of a common family and a shared enterprise is a wholly good thing. Other countries will have their own path, but I think it's important that in countries like Britain and America, that leaders stress the vital role that education can play in breaking down barriers and helping to build a sense of one nation.
Okay, I think that's about time now, but I just wanted to thank Michael and Arne for joining me today. It's been fantastic to have you as guests to the Global Educational Skills Forum.